November 1st, 1700. The inbred and sickly King of Spain, Carlos II, dies at the age of 38, with no heir to replace him, leaving the vast, rich Spanish Empire without ruler. The two great dynasties of Europe, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, raced for the throne, only for the crisis to spark into all-out war. Forgotten in history, the war would last around 13 years, with war waged on such a scale and devastation not seen since the 30 Years' War, on several fronts, on multiple continents. This is the War of the Spanish Succession. By early 1708, the Grand Alliance found itself in a frustrating situation. After the battles of Ramillies and Turin, a quick invasion of France and Spain had been dashed by terrible defeats at the Battle of Almanza and Siege of Toulon the previous year. It had given the Bourbons time to breathe, reorganize, and a much-needed boost in morale. The Imperials were still slightly demoralized by the death of Emperor Leopold I in 1705, now succeeded by his oldest son, Joseph I. As the campaigning season approached in early 1708, the Allied army commanders in Flanders would convene to plan their next move. The campaigns of Italy and southern France were halted after the defeat at Toulon. That front would remain stagnant for the rest of the war. And after 1707, Prince Eugen agreed to bring his army of 30,000 men through the Rhine to Marlborough and camped near Brussels with the main Allied army of around 90,000 men. The Dutch were once again hesitant on committing large numbers of their forces beyond Flanders, their greatest fear being a French army taking advantage of an exposed Netherlands. The Dutch also began to suffer from war weariness and had trouble dealing with the disenchanted Flemish population, which the Dutch occupied. This delayed Marlborough's invasion of France further and instead convinced him to commit the sieges of Vauban forts in northern France. This would cost the Allies time, men, and resources, but if done well, would secure a path straight to Paris. And with that plan being in such capable hands, there was little doubt of failure. Opposing the Allies was the old Marshal Louis-Joseph de Vendôme, at the time arguably Louis XIV's best and most experienced marshal. In the previous years he had shown exceptional skill even against the likes of Prince Eugene in Italy, and rebuilt the battered army of Flanders after the beating it suffered at Ramillies. With him, King Louis XIV appointed his own grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, to share command of the army of Flanders. Burgundy, however, was a far less capable leader, not holding any previous battlefield commands. Despite the king himself telling Burgundy to follow the advice of the old marshal, he took it upon himself to bring forward a plan of a direct attack on Brussels and win over the Flemish population. Vendôme disagreed and advocated for an attack on the city of Huy. Military operations there would capture Allied attention away from Brussels and fight on suitable ground for the French cavalry. However, news of the arrival of Prince Eugen's men at Koblenz caused much concern and discouraged a siege. Vendôme still argued for a siege anyways, but letters from Versailles sided with Burgundy's plan. The month of June was a worrisome one for Marlborough. While he waited for Prince Eugen's army to reinforce his own, all he could do was write letters and inspect his army, protecting Brussels for the time being. Prince Eugen had his own trouble of trying to avoid the talented Marshal Berwick. The victor of Almanza a year earlier had been moved to the Rhine after his victories in Spain. He did not, however, chase Eugen with his 27,000 men, most likely not wanting to give up the lines of Stolhofen captured by the French in 1707. As the month came to an end, Vendôme and Burgundy had finished assembling their army of 100,000 men and went on the offensive, crossing the Seine River, then proceeding to rapidly advance towards Bruges and Ghent, swiftly capturing them. The loss of these towns cut off Marlborough's communications with England and Antwerp. The speed of such an offensive was shocking even to Marlborough. The Flemish townspeople welcomed the French like liberators from the Dutch. However, the next phase of the campaign would be undermined by the animosity between Vendôme and Burgundy. Despite the words and wisdom of Louis XIV, his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, refused to cooperate with Vendôme. still thinking himself best able to handle the situation over the much more experienced Marshal. The two commanders now adopted the childish attitude of speaking to each other as little as possible. For Marlborough, he prepared to meet the French, and struck out from camp on the same day. However, torrential rain and wet roads kept his army moving at a snail's pace. News of the capture of Bruges and Ghent, combined with the poor conditions, caused Marlborough and his men to become greatly fatigued. But on the 8th of July, Prince Eugen finally rode into Marlborough's camp, lifting the Duke's spirits once again. Considering Eugen a fellow campaigner and even a friend, Marlborough immediately sprang into action and met with Eugen to discuss their next move. They both agreed that the town of Oudenarde would be where to go next, and reinforced it with a detachment of 700 men. Marlborough's trusted cavalry commander, the Earl of Cadogan, was sent ahead of the main army to secure the vital crossing of the river adjacent to the town. On the night of the 10th, the French still remained a good distance from the town of Oudenarde. By the morning of July 11th, around 9 a.m., the town's river was safe to cross, and an hour later, the French army of around 80,000 men began marching from Gavre to Oudenarde. Cadogan immediately sent a message to Marlborough. Both he and Prince Eugen crossed the pontoon bridges to reconnoiter the Aisne village. A French advance guard under the Duke of Biron came within visible distance of the Allied troops, marching towards Huerne. Cadogan's battalions then moved towards the river Diepenbeck, while his cavalry under General Rantzau covered his left flank. Biron possessed a stronger force of cavalry and mostly Swiss infantry. They checked General Rantzau's squadrons. Biron occupied the village of Aisne, and from a church tower assessed the situation before him. Shocked by what he had seen in front of him, enemy cavalry, infantry, artillery, and pontoon bridges with vast columns of infantry waiting to cross. Immediately, he dispatched messengers to inform Vendôme and Burgundy that he had encountered the main Allied army. Vendôme then first received the report. Completely surprised, he said, "If they are there, then the devil must have carried them. Such marching is impossible." Vendôme ordered Biron's Swiss troops to attack around Aisne. However, those orders only reached Biron about a half hour later, around 1:30 p.m. By then, the situation began to change dramatically for the French. Biron's Swiss troops were slowly being driven back from Aisne's outskirts. Rantzau's dragoons began crossing the Diepenbeck around 3 p.m., outflanking the Swiss troops. Vendôme saw this from a distance and sent a message to Burgundy requesting that he throw forward his infantry and cavalry in a sweeping move. The Allied army, still strung out on the march over the Scheldt River, had been a juicy target for such an attack. But it is at this crucial moment that Burgundy fell into complacency. His troops arrived at the heights of Huiche, but they did not press their attack, instead pausing for, to Vendôme, no reason. It is also worthy of noting that Marshal Montagnard and General Pisseguier informed Burgundy that the ground between him and the enemy was not suitable for cavalry. He accepted the information without much thought, offering no rebuttal or second opinion to his officers. Historians are still confused as to how Burgundy's advisors could have thought this, as Allied cavalry was easily able to advance onto the field without any issue, and in front of them nonetheless. By now it had become clear that Burgundy would not attack. This left Biron to his own fate. Cadogan's battalions of infantry overwhelmed and routed the Swiss. Most of them surrendered, while the rest were cut down by Rantzau's cavalry. The French advance guard was devastated, only saved by artillery fire and incoming French cavalry. Rantzau had captured over 10 enemy standards and a few kettle drums. Cadogan's excellent command had allowed time for General Natzmer's Prussian cavalry and Argyll's 20 battalions to cross the Scheldt. The Prussians would reinforce the right flank around Huerne and Argyll's men on the left flank to Scherken. Burgundy once again failed to provide substantial support in face of the changing situation. His officers discouraged him from sending any cavalry to support the rest of the army. still somehow, bafflingly convinced by earlier reports of poor terrain. Burgundy once again offered no resistance to that idea, but instead sent a few battalions of his own against the village of Groenewald, which the Prussians occupied. After marching towards the village, the French infantry were met with a great fire from the Prussians, and after a good fight were eventually repulsed. The attack was senseless, and it is yet unknown why it was committed. Sick and tired of Burgundy's failures, Vendôme decided to personally lead 12 fresh battalions of infantry against the Allied line. Inspired by their marshal's bravery, the French infantry who were first repulsed by the Prussians joined in. The French infantry did not hesitate, and despite the Prussians being entrenched behind fortifications and fences, they could not withstand the pressure of the rigorous series of attacks. Around 50 French battalions joined the fighting. Unfortunately for Vendôme, his brave attack came too late. Argyll's line had come up and formed into line just in time to meet the French. The fighting was bloody, disorganized, and chaotic. Burgundy's 30,000 men still did not move to attack. It is most likely that Burgundy would have, but his staff would not allow one to go through, still convinced that they were above ground too poor to attack from with cavalry. Burgundy still offered no other opposition to them. If Burgundy attacked now, the French could overwhelm the whole Allied line and force them back across the Scheldt, but none came. Losing his temper and demeanor, Vendôme plunged himself into hand-to-hand fighting with a half-pike in hand. Still, it seemed like the French battalions would overwhelm the Allies as they slowly gained ground over Marlborough and Eugene. However, relief was coming to the Allies. General Autumn's battalions began moving across the pontoon bridges, with many Hessian, Saxon, and Hanoverian battalions following suit. Lumley's cavalry also appeared from Oudenarde itself. The Danish and Dutch troops under Lord Overkirk would be delayed by a broken bridge in Oudenarde. Marlborough noticed the Bozer Hill, unoccupied west of the battlefield. If Overkirk could get past the bridge and soon to the hill, he could surround the French army. Overkirk, riding ahead of his columns, received the order and would have his troops move there by 7 p.m. He finally crossed and sent a few Dutch battalions to aid Marlborough and prevent the French from enveloping him. Around this time, Prince Eugen took command of the Allied right flank, now reinforced by Lumley's cavalry. Eugen ordered a charge from the Allied cavalry against the French. Among those that participated in the charge the most were Nansmer's Prussians. The Prussians crashed into a line of French cavalry, driving them off immediately. The Prussians then turned their attention to 2 battalions of French infantry. The Frenchmen were caught off guard and also routed. The Prussians even reached an artillery battery, which they again overran. General Puységur and Marshal Montagnan's judgment were proven incredibly incorrect by the rapid and successful charge. However, the Prussians quickly lost control of themselves afterwards and met the well-disciplined ranks of the elite Maçons du Roi. The charge of these elite Frenchmen devastated the Prussians. Around 75% of their force was destroyed. Few escaped. General Natsmer's horse had been shot from underneath him, and he too suffered around 4 saber cuts. He and the survivors only escaped through a broad ditch. There they would take shelter behind Laudham's infantry. Despite their horrendous casualties, the sacrifice of the Prussians bought precious time for the rest of the Allied army, and diverted attention away from the French right, which the Allies wished to strike. Overkirk's squadrons charged down the now exposed French right wing. The once straight French line had now become a horseshoe in the envelopment. The attacks by the French disintegrated, and at 8 p.m., Marlborough ordered a halt to operations to round up captured prisoners. Burgundy, seeing the Dutch cavalry and infantry advance toward the French, panicked and packed up his army, leaving as fast as he could to prevent capture. Vendôme, covered in blood, sweat, dirt, and powder, eventually caught up to him around 10 p.m. Vendôme, furious at Burgundy, could not process how he remained inactive while in command of 30,000 men. He ordered a retreat under the cover of night, and snarled at Burgundy, saying, "And you, monsieur, have long had that wish." French army suffered around 5,500 men killed and wounded, another 9,000 captured, and 800 officers lost. 106 standards and over 4,000 horses, mules, and various other supplies captured by the enemy. Unlike in 1706, the French army of Flanders would not recover from such defeat for the remainder of 1708. Vendôme would resign his command until the events of 1710. Burgundy would surely never see another command. Although much of the blame can be placed upon his lack of coordination, his own staff definitely must share just as much as he, for they convinced Burgundy to not attack and gave the advantage to the Allies. The Allies, in contrast, would suffer around 3,000 men killed or wounded, all despite the immense pressure from the French and the late timing of the arrival of reinforcements. Once again, the arrival of Dutch cavalry had played a decisive, unsung role in the victory. Now their forces concentrated and boosted in morale with a great victory, the move on Paris would begin. However, Prince Eugen did not advocate for a direct attack, instead a dismantling of the French fortresses before them. It is one of the few times the two men disagreed with one another, but they both agreed on Eugen's strategy nonetheless. This would also keep the Dutch in check. Although this would have strategic importance, it would not end the war. The Battle of Oudenarde would not be the final large battle fought by Marlborough. With Louis XIV refusing a peace deal by the Allies, the decisive battle for the fate of France was only just about to begin, and would see the return of a familiar face, the Marshal Villars.